'Cause like a winter tonight, I thought I would always have light. The quick flash that you gave to me, so dark I could barely see. Looking
from wherever you are around the world, welcome and thank you for joining us. Today we're going to be exploring Jesus, the Dead Sea Scrolls. Jesus have a brother? All this and more with Dr. Robert Eisenman. He is the author of James, the brother of Jesus. He's the author of the Dead Sea Scrolls and the First Christians. He also wrote the book, The Dead Sea Scrolls Uncovered. He is professor of Middle East religions and archaeology and director of the Institute for the Study of Judeo-Christian Origins at California State University, Long Beach, and visiting senior member of Linacre College in Oxford. He was a senior fellow at the Oxford Center for Postgraduate Hebrew Studies and a U.S. Endowment for the Humanities Fellow in Residence at the Albright Institute of Archaeological Research in Jerusalem, where the Dead Sea Scrolls first came in. Let's welcome Dr. Eisenman to the circle. Welcome, sir.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
This is awesome. This is a great show. We got a lot of stuff to talk about.
Oh.
We've had a series a while back on who is Jesus. We had Professor Amy Jill Levine. We have had an imam. We've had a rabbi. Who is Jesus?
Well, I first had to, when you told me about who is Jesus, I mean, there's a lot of debate that people may not be aware of, but the debate at the moment is, did he exist? Was there a Jesus? I do think there was a Jesus, but I'm not sure that was his name. The point, what I'm trying to make is that the name is suspicious. The reason the name is suspicious is because Jesus is a Greek version of Joshua, which in Hebrew is Yeshua, which means he who saves. It's a very strong coincidence that the Savior in a religion is also named the Savior. And the problem being that we know in the Gospels, in a moment I can explain that, in the Gospels that there were four brothers. James, Simon, Jude, and Joses, Joses, probably a variation on Joseph or something like that.
I heard of Joseph.
Yes, Joses. And you know, the problem when the Gospels made a supernatural Christ, these four brothers turned into like brothers by another mother or cousins, or it's the official Catholic doctrine or what have you. But the point is, what seems to have happened is that Jesus basically, turned into himself. In other words, Joses was probably who the character was, but when we distanced Jesus from the other brothers and supernaturalized him, then Joses became his brother. And the same thing, Mary turns out to be an aunt in the Gospel of John, and so on and so forth. We got Mary, sister of Mary, in the Gospel of John. That's absurd. That is ludicrous. And that's what happens when you get a doctrine that transforms history. I'll make it short. What my problem is that what people do, and I don't want to downplay anyone's religion or faith, because faith is important and people should have it. They need it. But one should not confuse literature and history. So the thing is that what we have in the Gospels, for instance, is basically literature. It's a Greco-Roman literature written in Greek in the Roman Empire, serving a certain purpose for those who were writing it.
So they had an agenda.
Yes, they had an agenda to pacify the Messianic movement in Palestine. That's the agenda. So the agenda is turn the other cheek, which is a lovely doctrine. I'm not,
Sure.
Return good for evil, you see. If a man slaps you on the one cheek, turn the other, and so on and so on. But the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is what I'm somewhat known for, to my mind is the authentic messianic literature in Palestine. You have to realize that in the Dead Sea Scrolls, as it turns out, there are all the messianic prophecies that are later incorporated into Christianity and the Gospels and that sort of thing. But it's in a completely alien framework. That is, the scrolls hate the sons of the pit. They don't love their enemies, they hate them. They are preparing, and I'm not advocating this.
You're thinking the Essenes weren't they peaceful people?
Well, that is the propaganda that was put out by the scholarly consensus, which gets back to why we're beginning with the scrolls. And the point is, the people who first worked on these scrolls were mostly prelates of one kind or another. Father DeVoe was the head of the Dominican order in Palestine, and so on and so forth. Father Millik, et cetera, et cetera. And all these people, since they were basically Catholic in background, and by that time the division of Palestine had occurred, so the scrolls came in under Jordanian auspices, and they set up a basically Judenrein committee. A Judenrein committee meaning no Jews on it. So they saw this as a monastery like themselves. So they saw the Essenes as peaceful Essenes contemplating their navels and so on and so forth. But they weren't reading the literature. So in here we have some of the principal documents of the Dead Sea Scrolls that I translate. The Damascus document, the Habakkuk commentary, and the community rule. And these documents are not peaceful. They are not peaceful whatsoever.
Interesting.
There's a war scroll, which is outlining the final apocalyptic war against all evil on the earth. And they're somewhat crazy, of course. They think the Messiah is going to come with the heavenly angels, and they're fighting the might of Rome. So obviously you and I know that a little group like this in the wilderness can't beat Rome, the greatest army in the world, but they had a secret weapon, an atomic bomb. Their atomic bomb was the angelic host, but they had this idea that in order for the angelic host to join their forces, they really believed that it's in the war scroll that the angelic host was going to come into what they call camps. They had wilderness camps. John the Baptist would have been in the wilderness, a type of wilderness camp he would have been involved in. His doctrines are very similar to the Dead Sea Scrolls. But the point is, he probably was an earlier member of the group. But the point is, these camps had to be perfectly pure. What does that mean? Why did they have to be perfectly pure? No women in the camps, no fornication, no anything like that. If someone, for instance, I don't want to be crude, but if someone had a wet dream, had to go and have a bath and purify himself. Why? Because their doctrine was that the angelic host could not abide human impurity, would not join the camps if there was any impurity, not proper food, this kind of thing, in the camps, or anyone was impure. Because if they came in contact with human impurity, they couldn't go back up to heaven. I know, to us it's nutty. I'm not advocating this, but that is they're very original. They're very imaginative. But the point is that it's unfamiliar to anyone who knows Christianity.
I never heard of that.
No, of course. So these monks, basically, and brothers and so on, they weren't reading the documents. They were just assuming we're dealing with peaceful Essenes. But there's something that counterindicates this for your audience, and I'll say it quickly because it's so complicated. There was a Christian writer in the around 150 called Hippolytus, Hippollytus, and in his works he has a different version of the Jewish historian Josephus, upon which most of our historical knowledge is based. He's the one who tells us about the Essenes, but Josephus tells us something in Hippolytus, a different version than the one we received in Greek. So this was probably an earlier Aramaic version. And in that there are 4 groups of Essenes. There are the, ones that we've heard of. There are marrying Essenes. And then there are 2 others, Zealot Essenes and Sicarii Essenes. And Sicarii Essenes in Josephus, Sicarii is supposed to be named after the Sica, the curved dagger, the Roman sword that they used to assassinate their opponents, extreme zealots.
And these were Josephus' books.
Yeah. He doesn't like them. He hates them, but he tells us who they are. But we don't have to believe Josephus. The point of the matter is that he does make it clear that everyone's heard of Masada, where they committed suicide about 30 kilometers south of the Qumran, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. We did at Cal State Long Beach a walking survey of the whole area, so it's in in this book. We have all of the pictures of the walking survey that we did with our students, all the way down to Masada and En Gedi. Anyway, the point is that the Sicarii, so she tells us, were the ones at Masada who committed suicide. But we found Dead Sea Scroll documents there. That means that the Sicarii were using Dead Sea Scroll documents. So the point of the matter is, Hippolytus isn't so far wrong. And he says these people participated in the war against Rome. Josephus agrees with that. But not only did they participate in the war against Rome, if, for instance, he says specifically they didn't mind dying any kind of death, they were undergo any kind of torture, they would never reveal any information, and they preferred death to surrender. So they also, if they heard someone talking about the law of Moses, he says that, they would offer him circumcision or the sword. And that's what the Sicarii is. So the knife that he's talking about is not probably the assassin's knife, as Josephus, wants us to know in other areas. It's probably the circumciser's knife. And you see that it's like Islam or the sword. Islam has a lot in common, fortunately or unfortunately. I don't want to put any judgment on this, with the Dead Sea Scrolls. I think some ideas filtered down into the Arabian Peninsula, and Muhammad came in touch with that. But I don't want to make any Muslims angry, because for them, nothing occurred before Muhammad, and I don't want to gainsay any of that kind of thing.
Let me ask you a quick question, because you mentioned the Masada. Wasn't there a debate between whether they committed suicide or they were killed there?
There's lots of debates of that kind of, but I think it's pretty clear they committed suicide.
Suicide?
Oh, totally committed suicide. The reason is very simple why they committed suicide. When all hope was lost, and the Romans finished using the prisoners to build a ramp, and we have a picture of the ramp in here, they wanted to meet, they believed in the afterlife, and they wanted to meet their wives and young children in the afterlife. If they surrendered and the Romans took their women and their children and sold them to the brothels and as slaves, they would be impure. They could not be resurrected. Only the pure were resurrected in their view. Everyone was not resurrected the way we see it. So they would not see their kindred, their wives, their children. Therefore, they preferred to kill their wives and children themselves, so they would enjoy the afterlife together.
Also, if they kill them themselves, they would all go together.
That's right. That's right.
Different.
That's exactly what happened. I don't mean to be so assertive, but I know that's what happened.
You're the expert around here.
I know. Everyone's an expert, but in your soul, you know certain things. I know that.
That's interesting. Let me ask you this. We're going to go back to Jesus a little bit. The Dead Sea Scrolls give a different depiction of Jesus, if I remember correctly, because there's the Gnostics and all these other different things going on. Is it really different?
Well, the scrolls don't have a Jesus.
Oh, there's no Jesus.
No, what the scrolls have is a righteous teacher, a teacher of righteousness, who's their leader, and he, every time you see teacher of righteousness, which is why this book is so important, in the commentaries, like in Habakkuk or something like that, Habakkuk, I think it's 2:4 or something like that. The righteous shall live by his faith. Is the very passage Paul uses in Galatians and Romans and elsewhere to build his foundation of Christianity. They have it here, but they have a different exegesis of it. And it's totally different. The righteous is the righteous teacher. And you will live by your works and faith working together, and so on and so forth. It's a works righteousness ideology which they have. And so... Anyway, every time the passage righteous one is found in one of these prophets, they interpret it as the righteous teacher. And the righteous one is what Kabbalah, the mystical Jews, call the tzaddik. Most people have heard of the tzaddik, Z-A-D-D-I-K.
Oh, yes.
Well, every time tzaddik is in the manuscript, it's the righteous teacher. But we know from early Christian texts that James the Just in Latin and Greek, James Justus, is James the Tzaddik in Hebrew. James the righteous one. James Justus is righteous one.
Are they referencing James?
To my mind, James is the righteous teacher of the Dead Sea Scrolls, yes.
Well, that was it. And I got myself mixed up there because I put the Gnostic Gospels, but the Gnostic Gospels are not this.
So we do have one of the characters. Now, what I say at the end is that once we found the historical James, we found the historical Jesus. Because I say, just like Bobby Kennedy didn't differ very much from John Kennedy, you see, the Gospels don't like the brothers because Paul doesn't like the brothers.
Paul doesn't like the brothers?
No, he hates them.
Really?
He hates in Galatians. He says some in Galatians 2, some from James came down.
Yeah.
and wanted us to stop keeping table fellowship with Gentiles because they wanted to observe purity laws and eat only pure foods. And then Peter and Barnabas copied them in their hypocrisia. He calls them hypocrites. So Paul calls people don't read the scripture closely. In Galatians 2, your audience can look. Paul calls both Barnabas and Peter hypocrites. And
I'm getting all new lesson here.
oh yeah, well later on in the history of Christianity, the famous Christian theologian from North Africa, I forget his name now, wrote Jerome a letter in the early 400s and said to him, what are we to do about Paul calling Peter a hypocrite? How dare he do that? And Jerome wrote back, there's some things best left unanswered.
That was Augustine, wasn't it?
Yeah, Augustine. That was Augustine. You're right. That's
I
exactly
got one right out of this.
Yeah,
man.
maybe more than your brain is functioning. So yeah, I love that answer. Some things best left unanswered.
Don't even bother
He couldn't
with it.
answer. He couldn't answer. Oh, we can answer. They didn't like each other, and he's always heaping abuse on James. Paul is always heaping abuse on James and his movement. He says some people are so weak. He says in one of his, I think it's in 1 Corinthians. They'll only eat vegetables. Their consciences, they have weak consciences. He means that conscience for him is a euphemism for observing the law. And he knows that the James party, the some from James, and then they're also called in Galatians 2, the party of the circumcision. And you realize those are they're the ones who are coming down, and they are, in another language, the Sicarii Essenes.
You think those are the Sicarii?
Yeah, they insist on circumcision. The party of the circumcision.
The POC, huh?
Yeah, I don't want to make a big deal of it, but this is not easy stuff for an audience to grasp in one gulp. I will admit that, but that's why this is my most well-known book.
This isn't a 5-page book either. There's a lot of
James,
research
the brother of Jesus. Penguin book. I never in my life, when I was a kid, thought I'd get a 1,000-page book out in Penguin, and it's still being marketed. And it started in 1997. It's still on the shelves.
Well, you were on the History Channel too.
I've been on a lot of some channels and everything. This is my most famous book, though, James, brother of Jesus. No one even talked about him, and I put 1,000 pages together. And this is the pages, the New Testament code. This book here are the 1,000 pages we cut out of this one. So this one was the follow-up in 2005. The point what I was telling you earlier, that this book was published in 97, 98, both in England and in America, by Viking, and a fairly good publisher in England too. And it was reviewed in the Jerusalem Post in 1998. It came out in Penguin.
How did that go over?
And a great review in the Jerusalem Post. And so people in Israel would have suddenly begun to hear about James, the brother of Jesus, who would have never thought there was such a person, they don't know much about Jesus in Israel. And Jesus had a brother, Jacob, the son of Joseph. Lo and behold, 4 years later, an ossuary appears. Jacob, the son of Joseph, brother of Jesus. When I heard that, I just laughed.
On the ossuary, it says brother of Jesus?
Yeah, on the ossuary, yeah, but in different handwriting. In different handwriting.
And ballpoint pen?
No, the person chiseled it in with a different Well, it was a different hand. It was the. I don't want to say. I can't use the word forger. That's forbidden, so I don't do it. But anyway, whoever chiseled it on, I won't go any deeper into that. It's a different hand. And the point is that it clearly, James was, so if this was 62 when James was supposed to have died, James was so famous in the Jerusalem of his day because he was known as James the Tzaddik, James the Just, James the Righteous One. We know that's what he was called. And it's in all the early church literature. And yes, so, and he is the successor. And Paul admits he's the successor in Galatians 2. He said when the representatives of James came down, then Peter was under him. Peter had to follow his instructions. And if you read Galatians, and if you read even Acts 15, 16, you'll see that there's a Jerusalem conference that instructions are sent to the communities overseas. Abstain from, I think abstain from, pork, of course, strangle things, blood, and things sacrificed to idols, and fornication, and things sacrificed to idols. Well, Paul doesn't agree with that. Paul doesn't think you should abstain from blood. Paul doesn't think that you should abstain from any of those foods. He says everything in the butcher shop, he says in 1 Corinthians, is clean. So he's totally against the Jerusalem leadership, totally against them. Christianity, we know, comes from Paul. And that comes from overseas. So what was the Jerusalem doctrine? The Dead Sea Scrolls.
So the Jerusalem doctrines here
are in the Dead Sea Scrolls, because the scrolls are the messianic literature in Palestine, and they're led by a righteous teacher, and that righteous teacher parallels the character of James, the righteous one, in early Christianity, who functioned from the 40s to the 60s. So I go back to my initial question. Who would know Jesus better? Someone who admits he persecuted him? Someone who opposed Christianity and in fact killed one or two in his early life, and then got letters to arrest Christians, and suddenly got a vision, he claims, on the road to Damascus, etc. Or someone who grew up with him, was born with him, followed him, and so on and so forth. To me, any normal, rational person would say the one who grew up with him and knew him. But the whole world says Paul knows Jesus better. That's because Paul created the Jesus we know, which goes back to your original question. Jesus, yes, there were 4 brothers, James, Simon, Jude, and Joses. And the Gospels say, as the supernatural Christ developed, they were pushed over to being cousins. I just read an article the other day. Someone said that they're supposed to be, step brothers by another mother or something like that. I forget all that stuff. The point of the matter is that was the family. It's the supernatural Christ. Mary turns into her own sister, Mary the sister of Mary in the Gospel of John, and so on and so forth. So James was so famous in the Jerusalem of his day for 20 years. If there was an ossuary, you wouldn't put brother of Jesus because the Gospels hadn't been written yet, and no one would have known who Jesus was. And you wouldn't put that. You don't put brother of someone on ossuaries.
That's right, because the Gospels were found
90 to 120 or whatever. So the point is that people in Palestine wouldn't have known who this person was, so you wouldn't put that brother of Jesus on there. James didn't need that. You might put James the righteous one or something like that. James the tzaddik. Only a modern person would put that. And it's a different handwriting. So I immediately said that is not authentic. The ossuary is authentic. It's a Jacob, the son of Joseph ossuary, but they would have been plentiful. There would have been many ossuaries. We found many ossuaries, with those kinds of names because they were popular names.
Let me hold on for this. We're going to take a commercial break. This is unbelievable stuff. I hope you're enjoying it as much as I am.
You think it is? I'm surprised.
We'll see you back after this message.
Hi, welcome to Adelante. This is Adelante Recovery, and my name is Yvette Kuglin, and I'm part of the staff.
Adelante Recovery Center has helped people in dual diagnosis for 5 years. We accept most PPO insurances and provide luxury accommodations and 24-hour support. To speak with an admissions counselor, call 1-888-242-4450.
A lot of time we don't even know what's wrong with us, and sometimes we need to get away to figure that out. So if you want to go for a little retreat out in Corona Del Mar, which is a confidential location, we're here to help. So we're only a phone call away. Thank you.
Welcome back. Here we are with Dr. Robert Eisenman. Once again, the books. Well, there's too many to point out, but here's a couple of them that are great. The New Testament Code and James, the brother of Jesus. And
there's one other book you might want to mention to your audience, The Dead Sea Scroll Deception by Michael Bajan and Richard Lee, the people who wrote Holy Blood and Holy Grail. And they wrote a book about what we were doing, and I was the unacknowledged third author of that. That tells the whole dispute over the scrolls. And I had to correct around 100 errors that they made. So it's
100.
Yeah. Well, it's a tough subject, and so it's accurate. The Dead Sea Scroll Deception. Michael Bajan, Richard Lee.
Well, that brings me to the question now that I'm thinking about it. The Da Vinci Code.
The Da Vinci Code, yeah.
Did you watch it?
I did, yes.
How'd you like it?
Recently. It's good. It's a good mystery. No, it's a good mystery movie. It's nothing to do with anything serious. But I was surprised because I hadn't watched it recently. You know, the major character in the Da Vinci Code is, at least the negative one, or somewhat positive, is Lee Teabing. He's the one telling Dr. Robert somebody. And I said to him, oh, God, Dr. Robert is probably a takeoff on me because Lee Teabing is a takeoff on Bajan and Bajan and Lee. And I'm involved with Bajan and Lee telling him all this stuff. And he knows that. And he knows that we went to Rennes-le-Château together. And he knows that we went out in the Dead Sea. Michael Bajan came out in the Dead Sea together with me. And he knows that they wrote this book, The Dead Sea Scroll Deception. So he probably, I didn't realize, probably that Robert character, Professor Robert, is a parody of me.
Robert
It may not be, but Lee Teabing. Lee is Richard Lee, and Teabing is an acronym for Bajent. He just changed. He likes to play word games. The man who wrote Dan Brown, who wrote the Da Vinci Code. The problem is that Bajent Lee were upset about, he mentions their book, but upset about not getting some financial remuneration from all the money that, and so they sued him. But I thought that was a very foolish thing to do because you can't sue a novelist, that's just a novel after all, for something. So their lawyers said he stole the architecture of their work. My wife said, no, they should have sued them for misusing their names, for parodying their names in that way. Lee Teabing, that would have been a possible lawsuit, but the other one, and so they lost everything. They lost all their earnings and they lost all their royalties and so on because lawsuits in England are very expensive. Lawyers are very expensive. I know they ended up suing their own lawyers, and that, both of them died not long afterwards.
Really?
Richard Lee died of a heart attack, and Michael Bajan died of a bad liver transplant.
Oh, wow.
And Michael Bajan was my very close friend, and I regretted and mourn his death to this day. I knew Richard, but I wouldn't consider him a friendly person. I don't want to speak ill of those who have passed beyond, but you can't say he's my close friend. But he was someone I knew well. I had a thing about him because he took my work and often he would ascribe it to himself. And I have to say, Richard, you have to put a footnote there. Don't forget to put the footnote. He didn't like that at all.
Let me ask you a couple of questions. We're going to tackle some of the mysteries here because you don't get a resident expert all the time in the circle.
Yeah.
At least on this topic.
And I've been to Rennes-le-Château as well, so we did the radar ground scan there.
I was getting ready to ask you.
Yeah.
So what is going on over there?
Well, the point is that there is a church, and people are looking for the grave of Mary Magdalene and that kind of thing. It's all part of the Mary Magdalene cult. I was never that much involved in the Mary Magdalene issue. That's a feminist issue, which is fine, but it doesn't have much to do with Palestine of the 1st and 2nd century because, honestly, that's the point I was trying to make at the beginning. You have to distinguish literature and history. Just like Homer's works are literature. You're not going to take the Odyssey as complete history. You're not going to take the Iliad as complete history. These are literary works. The Gospels are likewise literary works. To get the history, you've got to penetrate much, much harsher and much deeper into things. So when you're trying to talk about a wife of Jesus or a Jesus cave or a gospel, after a couple of gospels appeared, it turns out it was a whole, a cottage industry writing gospels. There's hundreds and hundreds of, not hundreds, but literally 100 or so apocryphal gospels have appeared. They've found the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, the Gospel of Peace. There's all kinds of gospels have suddenly, the Gospel of Judas Iscariot. All these gospels have suddenly, appeared, and the ones we know are the ones that Constantine in the 4th century at the Council of Nicaea, made it orthodox to recognize.
They had an agenda too.
Yes, they had an agenda, but I don't take those as historical documents. So what I've said, yes, I don't doubt that there was a crucified person. I don't know what his name was, and I know he had a brother called James. And what I'm saying is that since, brothers don't really fall very far, sometimes they do, but rarely do they do that, particularly one who succeeds the other. So I'm saying it's easier to find James because he hasn't been so overwritten. No one's bothered about him. So the material that we have about James is fairly authentic. Now you take the book of Acts, where James is mentioned, but there are two Jameses. Well, what do you mean two James? There's James, the brother of John. Oh, well, that's already rewriting things. Maybe there was a James, the brother of John, maybe there wasn't. We know there was a James, the brother of Jesus. Now, very fortunately, James, the brother of John, evaporates about Acts about 12 or 13, setting the stage for the introduction of James, the brother of Jesus, in chapter 15. But the Acts never tells us who James, the brother of Jesus, was. Suddenly there's a James, and there's a Jerusalem conference, but James, the brother of John, has been killed, crucified, or done to death by the authorities. And they even say, go tell James, that means the other James, that I've escaped, Peter at one point in early point of Acts. There's another thing people don't know. The first 15 chapters of Acts are third person. He, they. The last chapters of Acts from 15, 16 onwards, what we call the we document, I, we. That's because the last 10 chapters or so of Acts are probably based on a travel document or diary of a person like Luke, who is described, the authorship is ascribed to Acts. And the first are more like the Gospels, more literary. The last parts are more reliable, more down to earth. We did this, we went here, we did that. And Acts 21:21 is the key to everything. Paul comes up to Jerusalem and he meets James. Now, Acts never tells us who this James is, but he's the leader of the church and he's clearly over Paul. And he comes to see Paul and comes to see James. And then the we document said, quotes this James. But you see, Paul, many have heard that you've been teaching against the people, against the law, and against the temple all over Asia. Well, we know he has been. He teaches against the law and the temple and against the people. And so to show there's no truth to these rumors, we want you to go into the temple and pay for a Nazarite oath on the part of people who are being dedicated, 4 people we have under Nazarite oath, which had some expenses attached to it. And Paul, seen as rich because he raises money in all these communities, he's always raising money in his letters, so nothing loath, he says, sure, and he goes in. And it's at that point in Acts that a riot occurs in the temple. And the people all shriek, this is the person we've seen all over Asia Minor, teaching against, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Oh, yeah. And they take him and throw him out of the temple and bar the door behind him. And then the Roman soldiers come down and rescue Paul and make the people listen to him. That's all the later part of Acts. Now, that to me is pretty authentic stuff.
That sounds like it.
That's pretty authentic stuff, and that's very different character than the early part. So the early part is more literary, the later part is more historical. So the I-we document type material is pretty historical, and the letters of Paul are pretty historical, the ones that are considered authentic. Galatians, 1 or 2 Corinthians, Philippians, and so on. So
let me ask you this. How about the authorship? That's been in question for recently in the last 10, 20, 30 years. I think in seminary they actually have taught it for decades, but the authorship seems to be in question. Did Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John write it? We don't even know who they are, right?
Those titles came on at some point, but you see, my feeling is there's a huge body of literature that develops in the way literature does develop. It's not necessarily historical literature. If you want to emphasize Mary Magdalene, or if you want to emphasize Judas Iscariot, or so on and so forth. So this literature, we have 3 synoptics that are variations on each other from different places. We have John that doesn't even agree with them on many, many points. And they're all writing about this, quote, Jesus, and where is he mentioned in Paul's letters? So I'm not sure. You see, I do think there was a Jesus. A lot of people don't understand, and I don't want to make it too complicated. In the historian Josephus, who's the key here, first century Jewish historian, died around 96, who wrote 2 books, the histories and the Antiquities and the Jewish War. The Jewish War was to praise Titus and Vespasian, who destroyed the Jews and the temple. He went over to them. That's why they gave him their family name. He was the original Ben-Hur. He's called Flavius Josephus because Flavians were the name of the new imperial family, who got that way because of their victories in Palestine.
He switched sides.
He totally switched sides. He was a traitor. He even sort of describes in his autobiography, that's also in his work, The Vita, which has come down to us, that he goes out under Titus's instructions to speak to the people on the walls of the temple on the walls of Jerusalem when they have it surrounded, asking them to surrender. And someone has a sling and flings an arrow and hits him on the head and he falls down. He describes this, Josephus. And a huge cheer went up from the ramparts of Jerusalem, he says, because they thought their enemy Josephus was dead. He admits that unabashedly. He knows that the people hate him. You see? So the point is that he dedicates his work to a person called Epaphroditus. If you look at the beginning of Antiquities, he describes who Epaphroditus is. You look at Philippians 2 and 4. Paul's apostle and fellow soldier in Christ is called Epaphroditus.
That's right, Epaphroditus.
And he sends him to Rome, to the household of Caesar. And to my mind, these are the same people. And this is the connection of Josephus to Paul. And why do they want to write these books of Jewish history? So they can produce these Gospels. Because they base a lot of the Gospels on what Josephus is writing. So he writes these materials under Epaphroditus' sponsorship. Now, it's a crazy story about Epaphroditus. Epaphroditus is in Nero's household, secretary for Greek letters, but somehow he survives into the Flavians. And what happens is when Titus, I think it's Titus or it's, it's when Nero, who he was in the household previously, commits suicide. Mm-hmm. Epaphroditus is one of his, right-hand men or, one of, in his cabinet or whatever. He holds the sword on which Nero runs on to kill himself. Later he held the sword, for Nero,
Sure.
Later on.
It was nice of him. Yeah.
Not Vespasian and Titus like Epaphroditus, so he's able to sponsor Josephus' works and so on. But Domitian, the third Flavian, Titus's younger brother, doesn't like them. And he has Epaphroditus arrested, and he executes him. And what's the charge? Raising his hand against an emperor. Raising his hand against an emperor. And later on, someone assassinates Domitian. And who is it? A woman called Flavia Domitilla. Flavia is the feminine name. We have the Domitilla catacombs even to this day in Rome on her property. She was an early convert within the Flavian family itself to Christianity. Her servant Stephanos assassinates Domitian. And that Stephen is a hero of the book of Acts, if you recall, appears out of nowhere in the book of Acts. So what I'm trying to get at here is that you have to try to put these things together in some kind of careful way. But I don't take the Gospels. To me, that's later literature. You want to know what Messianism was like in Palestine itself, not in Rome, not Pauline Roman Messianism, but Palestinian Jamesian Messianism? Go to the Dead Sea Scrolls.
That's where they're going to tell you how it was over there.
That's where you'll find that literature is very different. Because I'm not advocating it, but as I was saying, they have the wilderness camps. The heavenly host is going to join them. It has to be absolute purity because the heavenly host can't abide human impurity. They don't believe in turning the other cheek. They don't love their enemies. They hate the sons of the pit. None of this agrees with the gospel. Oh, it's nice. The gospel doctrines are nice. Yes, if you want a peaceful group of people who are under the control of the Roman Empire, fine. But you don't want a rebel, crowd who are preaching the final apocalyptic war against all evil on the earth, and the epitome of all evil is the Roman Empire.
That'd be a problem.
You don't want to be marketing that kind of literature, you see. So this is my problem. And so I say it's easier to find the historical James. And I say, who and whatever James was, so was Jesus.
So I know one of the questions somebody brought, one of the scholars...
Does that make any sense to you?
Oh, yeah. It's great stuff. It's like somehow you've made the Bible into Downton Abbey here. I don't know how you did that, but...
Well, I love this James character. I think he's a marvelous character. And we're not denying the characters in early Christianity. We're just reversing a few of the things that have been reversed. We're reversing them back.
And Josephus doesn't really write about Jesus very much.
No, he doesn't write about it.
A couple of lines, I think.
I was going to say there was a Samaritan Taheb, which is a Redeemer figure, who was executed by Pontius Pilate in a town called Lyd. It's in the Talmud, and it's also in Josephus. And he would have been a Joshua Redivivus, because the Samaritans followed Joshua. And so their Redeemer figure would be a reincarnation of Joshua, Jesus. So he would have been a Jesus incarnate, you see? And he was crucified by Pontius Pilate.
And Joshua, you said, was a Greek Jesus.
Jesus is Greek for Joshua, Yeshua.
Right.
Yeah. So I think that Taheb somehow became incorporated into the gospel presentation of Jesus.
Fascinating stuff. We got about 5 or 6 minutes.
All right,
I want you to wrap up everything here. No, just kidding. A couple things. The Shroud. You have it on the cover of your book.
Right.
True, false? Nobody knows?
I'm impressed by the Shroud.
Really?
But I don't
seen it?
necessarily... I haven't seen it. I've seen
Yeah.
the pictures of it. I'm impressed by it. I don't think you could forge such a thing. But I'm not sure it's a miraculous thing. We don't have a lot of other bodies from that period that were wrapped in something like that, and that the linen was saved. I wouldn't be surprised. It was fairly common from the chemicals and the ointments that they put on the body that they ate into the linen materials. So I don't think there's just one such thing of this kind. And also the church denies the authenticity of the Shroud because it doesn't, the injuries and different things in it don't meet the picture of the gospel Jesus. So they don't, they called for the carbon testing because they wanted to show it was a forgery, the church. But the original people who found it thought it was real because it came from the Byzantine Empire. Where did they get it from? They got it from a place called Edessa, which was really Antioch on the Euphrates. It's in southern Turkey now and northern Syria. Now, to my mind, that's the original Antioch. People don't understand. There were 4 Antiochs in the empire.
4?
Yeah, because the person who, I'm saying it fast, the person who founded the Seleucid Empire's father was called Antiochus or Antiochus, and he named every city he founded after him. So there's Antioch in Pisidia, there's Antioch on the Orontes, there's Antioch Urho, there's Antioch in southern Iraq, which is now Basra. So to my mind, people have the wrong Antioch when they're talking about the Christian Antioch. They think it's the one on the coast. I forget what the river there was, but to my mind, it's the one in northern Syria, at the headwaters of the Euphrates. That's where Paul was operating, and I go into that in very great detail here to show that that is where things are happening, and that's where the wilderness camps are, and that's where a lot of things. Queen Helen of Etiabene, who converts to Judaism and gives the golden candelabra to the temple. We have a picture of that in here. The very candelabra that the Romans take, and you see it on the Arch of Titus. What they did with that golden candelabra, which she had given after she converted, they melted it down and built the Colosseum, the Temple of Death. They took the temple treasure and built this horrible stadium for blood sports. That's what became of the wonderful temple treasure, because the Flavians understood that people like to be amused. Like they like to be amused by sports.
Yeah, gladiatorial days. Before we go here, a couple more.
We have to have a Laker stadium here. You know what? We'll have to amuse the people.
We have a fastball question coming for you, but not yet. Fastball question not yet.
No,
Before the fastball question, scholars have also said, I don't know if you're included in this.
No, I'm not a scholar.
I'm just Robert Eisenman.
I'm just a loser, John. Though you might know, it might be interesting for your folks to know that I am the brother of Peter Eisenman, who designed the Holocaust Memorial in Berlin, and also at Santiago de Compostela, which is where the James pilgrimage goes in northern Europe, in northern Spain, the visitor center and the center of culture of the province of where Santiago de Compostela is. And to make it short, the Arizona Cardinal football stadium, because he loved football when he was a kid, and everyone loves the Arizona Cardinal football stadium because they roll the turf in and out of that place.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. So the question was, there's a lot of messiahs during those times. There were a lot of people that were going around preaching salvation. There were other Jesuses, some say. There was during the same time as the Jesus in Christianity. There was one gentleman who was very similar, Apollonius. I think of Tyana.
Yeah, there are a lot of people. I don't think he claimed to be a Messiah. Josephus Josephus is the. You have to read through Josephus, and you have to, like when you have a bad curvature of a lens out in space, you have to make corrections for the biases of Josephus and his hatreds. Like he hates the zealots, so he portrays them as horrible, nasty, vicious people, when in fact they were probably righteous, anti-Roman, people who sacrificed their lives. So you have to make corrections for the curvature of Josephus's mind. But the data is encyclopedic. So we have a huge, and he does talk about several kind of messianic type pretenders, candidates, and so on. And as you say, he doesn't really mention Jesus. People think that's an interpolation, but he does mention the Samaritan Tahib. And I don't think that's an interpolation. No reason to interpolate that. And so I think that, in fact, there was, and he does mention James. He discusses the death of James the Just, 62. We wouldn't know the date in his Antiquities, and he explains the circumstances. And they agree. I want people to know, in this book we have a document called the Habakkuk Pesher, the commentary on the prophet Habakkuk 2:4, the building block of Christianity. Habakkuk 2:4, the righteous shall live by his faith. They're doing a analysis of that too in the Habakkuk commentary. And to my mind, all the details of a James-type figure and death are in the Habakkuk commentary. Look at the Habakkuk commentary, look at the life of James, and tell me that we're in another world. So, what happened? How come the scrolls are so misinterpreted? We started with that because the people who got control of the scrolls at the beginning were a group of prelates who only saw the scrolls through their own prism of their monastic experience and didn't understand this supernatural holy war ideology which Muhammad, let's say, took a hold of. And so they wouldn't let anyone see the scrolls. They had a small group who saw a small section of the scroll documents, and they'd give the scrolls out to selected people who saw the scrolls the way they did. And we call this the monopoly and consensus. And in the years 88 to 92, I and one or two others broke the consensus. And I got a hold of all the pictures through certain sources. And we published all the pictures and broke their consensus. And the reason we're having an exhibit up here in Los Angeles now is because we broke that consensus and let 1,000 voices sing. And that's what the Dead Sea Scroll Deception is about. That's how I got somewhat known.
Extremely fascinating. Fastball question. You ready, sir?
By the way, the reason we wanted to break it so that we could get new interpretations. Yeah, go ahead.
We ask all Old Testament scholars this tricky question. Genesis 6:2, if I remember correctly. The sons of God came down to mate with the women of men.
What's wrong with that?
Well, that question was, who are the sons of God?
This is literature.
Not true.
This is not history necessarily.
Not angels.
Hey, look, who were the sirens? Who were Circe in Homer's Odyssey? You know, I'm not responsible for what ancient writers put into their literature.
Well, the sirens might be. I don't know.
Sons of God. I'm sure that they were trying to express the old Greek pantheon, but the Canaanites would have had a pantheon, and lots of others had a whole plethora of gods of different kinds. And I think that's what they're talking about, the Greco Canaanite type stories of gods mating with human women. I mean, don't you have what's her name? Who I think it's Hercules. Hercules' mother has a human mother and a godlike, and Zeus is his father, or
Zeus and Helen or something,
or Poseidon, or this was all the time occurring in the Greco, not just the literature of the East as far as the Persian Empire world. So this kind of, I think that's all that's being alluded to there. I don't think it's a great mystery. I don't think that one has to believe in it.
Sounds good. Dr. Robert Eisenman, thank you so much for being on The Circle. Fabulous. I mean, 45 minutes felt like 2 minutes.
And these books are available. We're leaving some with my good friend Carlos here. So we're leaving that one, and we're leaving this one here, which is the story of my travels when I was younger.
Thank you very much, sir. And we're also going to raffle off some of these books. So you don't want to miss out on that. Once again, Dr. Robert Eisenman here, the books right here, the New Testament Code. James, the brother of Jesus.
And the New Jerusalem.
And the New Jerusalem by Robert Eisenman. Thank you, everyone. Remember, our motto is simple. Wherever there's psychology involved, even in the Dead Sea Scrolls, we're going to be there. See you next time, everyone.